In the digital age, a shadow isn't cast by light, it is cast by location data. A trail of binary breadcrumbs leading a predator toward a target that thinks it is safe. In the hushed, amber-lit opulence of the Grand Regency's private dining room, where peace treaties were signed in expensive ink over glasses of vintage red wine, an assassination was unfolding packet by packet. Ji Won Kwon sat at the center of it all, a king on a velvet throne, unaware that the smartphone beside his hand was bleeding his life's coordinates into the dark. The blue light of the monitors was the only thing keeping the darkness of the call center at bay. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the world felt empty and the silence was heavy enough to touch. Danica sat at her desk, the soft hum of the computers acting as a heartbeat for her lonely shift. Her job was simple. Watch the data, fix the passwords, and stay invisible. For 2 years, she had been a shadow, hiding from a past that had stolen her name and her joy. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes, when a tiny red flash caught her attention on the corner of her third screen. It wasn't a normal error. It didn't look like a broken link or a forgotten login. It was a rhythmic, pulsing line of code that moved with a terrifying grace. Danica froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as she leaned closer, her fingers hovering over the keys. She knew that pattern. It was a zero-day exploit, a digital ghost designed to slip through doors that weren't even supposed to exist. This wasn't just a hack. It was a signature. The code twisted and turned, hiding itself within the hotel's guest network, but Danica could see the invisible threads. It was the work of the Quiet Hands, the elite group of hackers who had framed her and ruined her father's life. Seeing their work again felt like a cold hand tightening around her neck. They were here, in her city, and they were hunting. She quickly opened a private window, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tracked the signal's destination. It wasn't aimless. It was focused entirely on a single device. Located in the Grand Regency's VIP suite, the personal phone of Ji Won Kwon. Danica watched as the exploit turned the phone into a beacon. Every few seconds, it sent out a high-resolution location ping to a hidden server. It was a digital bullseye. The hackers weren't just stealing his bank details, they were guiding someone to his exact chair. They're going to kill him. She whispered to the empty room. The weight of her secret knowledge felt like a physical pressure. If she did nothing, a man would die, and the Quiet Hands would win again. If she acted, her ghost life would be over. She looked at her smartwatch, which was already beginning to vibrate as it synced with the intercepted signal. The red on her screen was moving. The ambush was already beginning to take shape in the real world. Danica stood up, grabbing her jacket. She couldn't be a shadow anymore. She had to be a bridge. Danica's fingers moved across the keyboard like lightning. She had to be sure about what she was seeing. The red pulsing line on her screen was not just random data. It was a digital map of the Grand Regency Hotel, and at the very center of that map was a bright, steady dot. That dot represented the target. With a few quick clicks, she pulled up the guest registry for the penthouse floor. Her heart nearly stopped when the name appeared on her screen, Ji Won Kwon. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew it, even if they only spoke it in whispers. He was a man of immense power, a leader who ruled the streets with a quiet but firm hand. To the world, he was a businessman, but Danica knew he was the only thing keeping the city's rival gangs from tearing each other apart. If he fell, the streets would turn into a war zone. But it wasn't just Kwon's name that made her blood run cold. Beside the map of the hotel, a separate window began to populate with new data. Small, gray triangles were appearing on the street level of the hotel. They were moving in a coordinated pattern, surrounding the exits and heading toward the service elevators. These were not hotel guests or tourists. They were moving with the cold, calculated speed of professional hunters. The quiet hands, Danica whispered, her voice trembling. They weren't just tracking him, they were closing the net. She could see their locations updating every second. They were using the very same software that had once been used to ruin her life. It was a perfect, silent trap. The hackers in the dark were providing the eyes, and the men in the gray triangles were providing the blades. Ji Won Kwon was sitting in a room full of glass and gold, signing papers and drinking wine, completely unaware that he had been turned into a target. He didn't know that his own phone was whispering his exact location to the men in the elevators. Danica watched the screen as the gray triangles reached the lobby. She had less than 10 minutes before they reached the penthouse. She couldn't call the police, the quiet hands would hear the dispatch and vanish before they could be caught, or worse, they would trigger the hit early. She couldn't call the hotel front desk because she didn't know who was on the payroll of the enemy. There was only one person who could stop this, and she was currently staring at her reflection in the dark computer monitor. Danica grabbed her bag and her smartwatch. The grayscale life she had built to keep herself safe was over. To save the man on the screen, she would have to step back into the world she had worked so hard to escape. She headed for the door, the red light of the monitor still reflecting in her eyes. The cool night air hit Danica's face as she sprinted toward the towering glass of the Grand Regency Hotel. She had shed her worn-out work hoodie, revealing a sharp, dark blazer she usually kept for emergencies. In the dim light, she looked like any other corporate professional heading to a late-night meeting. Her heart was a drum in her chest, but she forced her breathing to slow down. To save a king, she had to act like she belonged in his castle. As she reached the heavy glass doors, a tall security guard stepped into her path. He looked at her with suspicious eyes, his hand resting near his belt. Danica didn't flinch. She held up her smartwatch, which was flashing a fake corporate ID she had mocked up in the car. "I'm with Global Systems Support," she said, her voice smooth and firm. "We detected a major data leak in the penthouse network. If I don't patch it in the next 5 minutes, the entire hotel's guest encryption will fail." The guard hesitated, glancing at his radio. Danica knew she had to push harder. She tapped her earpiece, pretending to listen to an angry boss. "Yes, sir, I'm at the door now. I know the VIP is in a meeting. I'll be quick." She looked back at the guard with an annoyed expression. "Do you want to be the one to explain to the manager why every credit card in this building just got hacked?" The guard's face paled. He stepped aside and swiped his key card, opening the gate. "Elevator is to the left," he muttered. Service. Danica nodded and walked past him, her boots clicking loudly on the polished marble floor. She didn't look back. Inside the elevator, she pressed the button for the penthouse and watched the numbers climb. On her wrist, the smartwatch screen flickered. The gray triangles, the assassins, were already moving through the lobby behind her. They were using the service stairs to avoid being seen, but she could see them plain as day on her digital map. She was inside the perimeter, but the hardest part was just beginning. She was a digital surgeon entering a room full of butchers, and her only weapon was a warning they might not believe. The elevator dings, and the doors slid open to the smell of expensive lilies and the silent threat of death. The double doors of the private dining room felt as heavy as vault gates. Danica took a slow breath, smoothing her charcoal blazer. She forced her face to stay calm, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. As she stepped inside, the warm, golden light of the room felt like a trap. The air smelled of expensive red wine and roasted meat, but underneath it all, she could feel the cold edge of danger. She didn't look at the men standing by the walls, but she felt their eyes. They were like statues in dark suits, their faces blank and their hands folded in front of them. Their stares were heavy, weighing her down with every step she took toward the center of the room. They didn't know who she was, and in their world, anything unknown was a threat. At the head of the long wooden table sat Ji-won Kwon. He was leaning forward, a black pen in his hand as he looked over a thick document. His black hair was slicked back, and the tattoos on his neck moved as he breathed. He looked like a predator at rest, powerful and calm, but ready to strike at any second. Beside him sat an associate in a red tie, who watched Danica with a look of pure suspicion. Danica moved closer, her eyes fixed on the smartwatch hidden under her sleeve. It pulsed against her skin, a secret rhythm that told her the attackers were almost there. On her screen, the gray triangles had reached the floor. They were standing right outside the service entrance. Time was running out. Kwon didn't look up at first. He continued to sign the paper, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the silent room. The silence was suffocating. Danica felt like she was standing in the path of a storm. She knew that if she made one wrong move, the guards would tackle her before she could say a single word. Finally, Kwon stopped writing. He slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes were sharp and dark, piercing through her as if he could see every secret she was trying to hide. He didn't say anything, but his presence filled the room, making it feel small and tight. He was used to being the most dangerous person in any room, but he had no idea that a digital ghost had already found a way to kill him. Danica leaned in, closing the gap between them. She could see the reflection of the room in his dark eyes. She knew that once she spoke, there was no going back to her quiet life. She was stepping out of the shadows and into the fire. The air in the private dining room was thick and heavy, smelling of expensive wood and old wine. Danica walked slowly across the soft carpet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. She kept her head down, trying to look like just another worker in a dark blazer. To her left, the man with the red tie watched her every move with eyes that were as cold as ice. To her right, the guards stood tall and still, their hands resting near their jackets. She knew that one wrong move would be the last thing she ever did. She looked down at the face of her smartwatch. The screen was no longer just a watch, it was a battlefield. A single blue dot sat in the center, representing Ji-won Kwon. Moving toward it from 3 different sides were the red triangles of the trackers. They were moving fast now, weaving through the hallways just outside the heavy oak doors. On her screen, the distance was shrinking. 10 meters. 5 meters. Ji-won Kwon sat at the head of the table, his jet-black hair shining under the gold lights. He was calm, leaning over a document with a black pen in his hand. He had no idea that he was sitting in the middle of a digital bullseye. Danica reached the edge of the table. She could feel the heat from the candles and the suspicious gaze of every man in the room. This was the moment she had to choose between being a ghost and being a hero. She took a deep breath and leaned in close, her shadow falling across the paper he was about to sign. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne. As she bent down, her arm rested near the table and her smartwatch flashed a final warning. The red triangles on her screen had overlapped with the blue dot. The trackers were at the door. Kwon paused, his sharp eyes flicking up to meet hers. He looked annoyed, his eyebrows furrowing as if he were ready to have her thrown out. But Danica didn't flinch. She leaned even closer, her lips almost brushing his ear. She spoke in a whisper that was as sharp as a knife, the words cutting through the quiet hum of the room. "Do not sign that paper," she murmured. "Seconds out. They're tracking your phone." The ambush is 30 for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Kwon's hand froze over the document. His pupils contracted, his gaze turning from annoyance to a terrifying, cold focus. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look at his guards. He looked straight at Danica, searching her eyes for a lie. Outside, the faint click of a door handle turning echoed through the silent suite. The 30 seconds were gone. Danika's heart felt like it was going to burst through her chest as she stepped into the small space between the men. The smell of expensive wine and old wood filled her nose, but all she could focus on was the man in the center. Ji-won Kwon looked calm, his pen moving smoothly over the paper, but his eyes were sharp. He was a lion in a suit, and she was stepping right into his reach. She leaned in, her body tense. To the guards, it looked like she was just a tech worker checking a connection. But as she moved closer to his ear, she could feel the heat radiating from him. The red light on her watch was pulsing faster now, a silent scream that only she could hear. The trackers were almost at the door. "Don't look at me," she whispered, her voice low and steady despite the fear. "And don't stop signing. Your phone is a beacon. There are assassins in the hallway, and they are using your GPS to find your heart." Kwon's hand didn't shake. The pen kept moving, leaving a dark trail of ink on the white page. But Danica saw his eyes change. The warmth left them, replaced by a cold, hard light. He didn't turn to look at her, but she felt his entire body go still, like a spring being wound too tight. He was a man who lived in a world of threats, and he knew the sound of truth when he heard it. Beside him, the man in the red tie narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in the air. He started to reach for his jacket, his hand moving toward a hidden weapon. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing down on everyone like a physical weight. Every second felt like a minute. Danica stayed bent over, her arm resting near the table, her watch glowing a faint, angry red. Kwon spoke, his voice a quiet rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "How long?" "Seconds," Danica breathed. "When I move, you need to drop. I'm going to kill the lights." Kwon took a slow breath and finally looked up, not at her, but at the door. He placed the pen down with a deliberate click. It was the loudest sound in the room. In that moment of pure tension, the air seemed to freeze. Danica gripped the edge of her blazer, her finger hovering over the command on her watch that would plunge the room into darkness. The bridge was built. Now, they just had to survive the crossing. The first gunshot cracked through the room like a lightning bolt hitting a tree. Danica didn't wait to see where the bullet landed. She slammed her finger onto the screen of her smartwatch. "Down," she screamed at Ji-won Kwon. As he dove behind the heavy wooden table, Danica's fingers danced across the digital interface of her watch. She wasn't just a girl in a blazer anymore, she was the master of the building's nervous system. With one final tap, she sent a virus into the hotel's main power grid. Suddenly, the bright chandeliers flickered once and died. The opulent dining room was plunged into a thick, heavy darkness. Screams of confusion echoed from the hallway, but Danica could still see. Her watch glowed with a soft blue light, showing her the infrared heat signatures of everyone in the area. The assassins were blind, but she was just getting started. She tapped into the elevator controls next. On her screen, she saw the gray triangles, the quiet hands attackers stuck in the service lifts. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she locked the gears and cut the cable's electronic brakes. The elevators groaned and screeched, stopping dead between floors. She had turned their own transport into a steel cage. "The stairs," she whispered, grabbing Kwon's arm. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst, but her mind was as clear as ice. She used her watch to override the electronic locks on the heavy fire doors, clicking them shut behind them as they moved. To the attackers, the hotel was now a shifting maze. Hallways that were open a second ago were now blocked by ironclad security shutters. Every time an assassin tried to use a keycard, Danica's watch buzzed. She simply deleted their access codes in real time. She was rewriting the architecture of the building, brick by digital brick, to keep the predators away from their prey. In the dark, she was the only one who knew the way out. Kwon followed her, his eyes wide with shock. He had spent his life being the most dangerous man in the room, but now he realized that the girl with the smartwatch was the most powerful person in the city. They reached the service stairs just as the emergency sirens began to wail, a mechanical cry in the silent, blacked-out hotel. The swinging doors of the industrial kitchen slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sound of distant gunfire. The air here was heavy with the smell of old grease and cold stainless steel. Ji-won Kwan's breathing was loud and ragged in the cramped space, but his eyes remained sharp, watching Danica for the next move. She didn't slow down. Her smartwatch was vibrating with a steady, angry pulse, showing the red dots of the killers moving through the dining room they had just left. "Give me your phone," Danica whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Kwan didn't argue. He handed over the expensive device, which was still glowing with the hidden malware that made him a walking target. Danica's fingers flew across her watch face, connecting to the hotel's internal network. She spotted a motorized food service cart parked near the entrance to the main freight elevator. She placed Kwan's phone deep inside a metal warming tray on the cart. With a few quick taps on her watch, she hacked the cart's simple computer, override its manual controls, and set it to move. The cart began to roll away with a low hum, heading toward the far end of the kitchen and toward a service lift that led to the laundry rooms. On the assassin's screens, it would look like their target was making a run for the basement. "The beacon is moving," she murmured, watching the gray triangles on her screen pivot and chase after the empty cart. "They're taking the bait. We need to go, now." She led Kwan through a narrow, dark hallway hidden behind a stack of crates. This was the service tunnel, a concrete vein that ran through the heart of the building, used only by staff to move trash and supplies. It was cold and smelled of damp earth. They moved in near total silence, their footsteps muffled by the heavy shadows. Danica kept her eyes glued to her watch. The red dots were now converging on the laundry lift, exactly where she wanted them. She could feel the tension in the air, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. One wrong turn would lead them right into the path of a second team, but she knew the digital map better than her own home. "Left at the next junction," she signaled, her hands steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. They reached a heavy metal door marked with a faded yellow sign. Behind it lay the underground parking garage and the path to the street. As Danica reached for the handle, she felt a sudden shift in the data on her wrist. The killers had reached the food cart. They had found the phone. The distraction was over, and the hunt was about to get much more personal. She pulled the door open, the cool night air hitting their faces like a promise of survival. The safe house was cold and smelled like old dust, but it was the first place Danica felt she could finally breathe. Ji-won Kwan sat across from her, his white shirt stained with dirt and his tattoos dark against his skin. He watched her with a look that was no longer scary, but curious. His men stood by the door, their phones put away, finally understanding that the digital world was just as dangerous as a dark alley. "Why did you do it?" Kwan asked quietly. His voice was like a low hum in the small room. "Could have stayed in your office. You could have stayed safe. You." Danica looked down at her smartwatch. The screen was cracked, and the glowing red dots had finally disappeared. "I didn't do it just to save you," she admitted. Her voice was small but steady. "Hands. I did it because of them. The people who were tracking you, they are called the Quiet." Kwan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He had heard of many enemies, but this name seemed new to him. 2 years ago, I had a real life." Danica continued. "I was one of the best at finding bugs in computer systems. But I found something I wasn't supposed to see. The Quiet Hands were stealing from everyone, and when I tried to stop them, they didn't just fire me. They erased me." She felt the old sting of tears in her eyes but brushed them away. "They made it look like I was the thief. They took my job, my home, and my name. I became a ghost because they took away everything that made me real. Kwon stayed silent, listening to every word. He knew what it was like to lose things, but he had never met someone who had been deleted by code. He looked at the document he had been trying to sign earlier. It was useless now. The real war was being fought with signals he couldn't see. They ruined my father, too. She whispered. He died thinking I was a criminal because he couldn't understand the lies they told on the internet. I've been hiding in that call center ever since, waiting for a chance to fight back. Kwon stood up and walked over to her. He didn't look like a scary boss anymore, he looked like a man who had found a partner. You paid a heavy price to warn me, he said. He held out his hand, not for a deal, but as a promise. They took your life with a keyboard. Tonight, we start taking it back. I have the power in the physical world, but I need your eyes in the digital one. No. More hiding, Danica. It is time for the ghost to become a hunter. The safe house was a cold room filled with the hum of heavy machines. Ji-won Kwon stood by the window, his shadow long against the floor. He did not speak, but Danica could feel his eyes on her. She sat at a wide desk covered in glowing monitors. Her fingers moved fast, tap dancing across the keys. This was her world. This was where she was no longer a ghost. They are still trying to hide, Danica said, her voice steady. On her screen, the digital map of the city was a web of blue lines. The quiet hands were smart. They used many different servers to bounce their signal around the globe. Every time she got close, the signal jumped to a new country. It was a game of hide-and-seek played at the speed of light. But Danica was smarter. She remembered the way they coded their zero-day exploits. She knew their rhythm. Instead of chasing the signal, she began to build a digital dam. She blocked their exits one by one. She was not just watching them anymore, she was trapping them. The red that had once hunted Kwon was now shaking. Danica leaned in, her face lit by the blue glow of the screen. She found a tiny crack in their armor, a small mistake in their latest update. She pushed through it. Suddenly, the web of blue lines vanished. A single, solid gold line appeared on the map. It didn't point to a far-off country. It pointed to a dark office building only 3 miles away. I have them, she whispered. Kwon walked over and looked at the screen. His face was hard like stone. For the first time, the hunters were the ones being watched. Danica didn't stop there. She reached into their system and began to pull out their secrets. She saw the files they had used to frame her. She saw the names of the men who had paid for the hit. She was taking back her life, one file at a time. The quiet hands tried to fight back. The screen flickered with warnings. They were trying to delete their own data to stay safe. But Danica was faster. She locked their system. She turned their own beacon against them. Now, every move they made was being sent directly to Kwon's private security team. The digital bullseye had shifted. Danica looked up at Kwon. She felt a strange sense of peace. For 2 years, she had been running. Now, she was the one standing her ground. She had turned the static into a clear path. The bridge back to her real life was finally being built, and she was the architect. The air in Ji-won Kwon's private command center was cool and smelled like new electronics. Danica sat in a chair that felt too expensive for someone who had been a ghost for 2 years. Before her was a wall of screens, each one showing the glowing guts of the Quiet Hands network. This was the dark heart of the group that had stolen her life, and now, she held the knife. Kwon's men stood behind her like silent statues. They were experts in physical strength, but in this room, Danica was the general. I found the main server, she said, her voice steady and calm. This is where they kept the fake files. This is the evidence they used to frame me and destroy my father's name. With a deep breath, Danica began to type. Her fingers moved with a grace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was attacking. She launched a virus that she had designed in the quiet hours of her old call center job. It moved through the quiet hand systems like a digital fire, melting away their secrets and breaking their locks. As the walls of the enemy's network crumbled, Danica found what she was looking for, the master log. It contained the original, unedited emails and the true bank records that proved she had never betrayed anyone. She didn't just delete the lies, she replaced them with the truth. She sent the files to every major news agency and the High Court. In real time, she watched as her name was cleared across the internet. The blacklisted labels vanished, replaced by the truth of her innocence. "It's done," she whispered, leaning back as the final screen turned green. The infrastructure of the quiet hands was gone. Their servers were dark, their money was frozen, and their reputation was in ruins. For the first time in 2 years, the weight on Danica's chest lifted. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. She was no longer a shadow hiding in the corner. She had dismantled her past to build a future. Kwon stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it meant she was no longer alone. She had used her skills to save a life, and in return, she had saved her own. The grayscale world was finally over, and the colors were coming back, brighter than ever before. The morning sun rose over the city, casting a bright light on the tall glass tower of Kwon Industries. Inside the top floor, the air was cool and quiet. Danica stood by the window, looking out at the streets below. 6 months ago, she was a ghost hiding in a dark office. Now, she stood in a room filled with the most advanced technology in the world. She was no longer running. She was finally home. Behind her, the soft hum of servers filled the room. This was the Iron Firewall, a digital fortress Danica had built from the ground up. It was not just a set of passwords or a simple lock. It was a living system that watched every byte of data moving through the city. She had spent day and night making sure that what happened to her and Mr. Kwon would never happen again. Every weak point was gone. Every back door was sealed. Mr. Kwon walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. He stopped beside her and looked at the wall of monitors. Each screen showed a different part of his empire, all protected by Danica's code. He didn't need to say anything. The respect in his eyes told her everything. He had given her the tools, but she had provided the heart. Together, they had turned her greatest fear into their greatest strength. Danica sat down at her main desk. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but they didn't shake anymore. She was the invisible hand, the silent protector who kept the predators at bay. She thought about her father and the bridge he had built. He had taught her that integrity was the only foundation that stayed strong when the wind blew. She had honored that lesson. She hadn't just saved a man, she had saved herself. The screen in front of her blinked with a new message. It was a routine check, but she handled it with the same care she gave to everything. The quiet hands were gone, their servers destroyed and their names erased. Danica was the one holding the keys now. She took a deep breath, feeling the peace that comes from knowing who you are meant to be. The grayscale world was gone. Her life was in full color, and for the first time in years, the bridge ahead was clear and strong.